first time here, welcome, and be sure to hit that like button. Today I'm going to talk about my review of the documentary Buckbreaking by Tariq Nasheed. I had a chance to watch it and I'm going to give my opinion on the good, the bad, and the ugly. Stay tuned. Overall, I think the documentary was pretty entertaining. I appreciated the videography and the different speakers that he brought in to try to tie together his points. Everything was engaging from start to finish. Wasn't really many lulls at all. So it was very enjoyable to watch. Another thing I think the documentary did pretty well was address how the traditional sexual practices of Europe were very distinctive from the traditional sexual practices of Africa. The cultures overall looked at reproduction and sex very differently, largely because of the different environmental differences. But I thought he did a really good job of explaining how there was a difference and how it wasn't until you started to see the cultures meet and you started to see there being, imperialism and different things like that. Those alternate ways of sexuality were introduced to Africa, which is why today, overall, Africa tends to be very conservative when it comes to sexuality, traditions, families, largely because those kinds of sexual practices are not inherent to their culture. So I thought he did a pretty good job of explaining that. Another thing that the documentary does well is show that white men and women were participating in slavery and systematic abuse. So often when slavery is talked about, I usually see it focused on the men and how they were abusing and the really harmful slave owners and how women were just kind of powerless, not doing anything there. And it's like, no, in reality, there are white male slave owners and white female slave owners, both who had the capacity to be just as brutal and just as aggressive. So I think it was good that he touched upon that. And that also really challenges the popular narrative today that men in general are just the most violent and have always been the most violent. Yeah, there might be certain times and in certain degrees where men can be more violent. Women can also be just as violent and can be just as brutal if given the opportunity. So I think it was good that he did touch upon how it was men and women working together to uphold systematic slavery. Another thing I think that the documentary did very well was touch upon how feminism at its core was racist and misandrist. Today feminism has evolved to its own form, and there are tons of Black feminists and tons of feminists of different ethnicities. But when it started, it was incredibly racist, and the founders did not like Black people, did not like Black women. And so I think it's important to touch upon that historical truth, because I think it starts to really paint a picture how at its core feminism was not really meant for Black people. It was not meant for Black women, and it certainly demonized Black men in particular. So that was very important, and I'm glad he touched upon that, because I think we still even see how some of those racist and misandrist elements can impact the Black community today. So here's a couple of other things that I noticed that to me seemed a little incongruent with the current FBA brand from Tariq Nasheed. Now, in this video, Black people and Africans were pretty much referred to interchangeably. There were even Pan-Africanists who were brought on. The whole Aboriginal culture did not come up at all. I know it's commonly been accepted, right, that Black people come from Africa, that our ancestry comes from Africa. But I know more recently, there's been this movement of Black people saying, hey, no, we're actually, Aboriginals, we were already here, we're the original people in America, et cetera, et cetera. What's interesting, though, is that although Tariq Nasheed has supported that and even promoted that on his Twitter page, I don't see any reference to that whatsoever in the documentary. I really only saw references to Africa. So there's a few people who identified as FBA, but there is very much an African presence in this entire documentary. Now, why is that important? Because, today there is this big ethnic online war going on between FBAs, ADOS, immigrants, Black people from different countries, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, it doesn't really make sense, because when you actually look at the history, especially as the history is even shown in the documentary, we see that there is a direct connection between lineage, even between culture, between practices. Like, we see some of those concepts being explained even within that own documentary, So I appreciated that throughout the documentary we saw a sense of unity. We saw these different people from different maybe political vantage points coming together and talking and sharing the historical union, really, that Black people from the diaspora have in connection to Africa, even the Caribbean, things like that. I appreciated that. But it also shows me that this online war, this digital war that I see happening, is largely performative. I don't really think it's real, because when you actually step back and look at history, you see that there isn't really a pure 100% Black lineage that doesn't have a connection to Africa, or doesn't have connection to Black people elsewhere. Like, that doesn't really exist based upon his own history that was shown within the documentary. So I thought that was very, 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 very interesting. And to me, it just solidifies the point that this whole ethnic war thing, the whole tether, I mean, there were a ton of tethers on his own documentary, as I would be so-called online. Yet they were working together, that they were showing that, like, hey, no, this happened, that happened, there's unity, there's connection. So I appreciated that, I totally did, but it also, to me, seems very incongruent with the ethnic wars happening online today, and it shows me that they're just performative, and they don't really mean anything when you actually look at the facts, and you actually study the history and understand what was going on. Now, another thing that I saw as problematic was how homosexuality was conflated with pedophilia. Yes, there was definitely homosexual slave masters, and there was definitely homosexual abuse, but to assume that underage rape, right, underage abuse was, homosexual in nature, and that it was, all based upon pedophilia, that's just not true. That's just not true. So I think that conflation of homosexuality with pedophilia, as if they're one and the same, I think can probably be considered very offensive. Again, I do think it was good that he at least referenced and shown that, like, hey, abuse that was happening at that time, it was not just man to woman. It was man to man too. There were men who were being abused by men, obviously physically, sexually, in all different manners. I did appreciate how he touched upon the fact that just because someone is LGBTQ or identifies as that or is involved in that movement does not mean that they cannot be racist. We see that historically. And yes, there have been times where the movement has gotten in the way of the progress of Black people. Today, there are very much gay and queer Black people out there who do experience racism from other queer or gay people within the LGBTQ community. So I think it's good that you touch upon that, because sometimes racism, homophobia is used interchangeably. I've seen, gays and new Black, things like that, and it's just not true when you break it down historically. Something I wish that was touched upon a little bit more was the resistance that was made from Black folks in America when it came to slavery and when it came to this kind of abuse. Honestly, my personal opinion is that if you were just to watch this movie, the feelings would be that, man, Black men as a whole were just, laying down and just taking it, like, with no fight, with no pushback. And we know historically that is not true. There were a ton of revolts that were made, not only in in the USA, but in all the Americas, really all across the diaspora. There were a ton of slave revolts. I mean, there were a ton of fighting back. I mean, that's even how the insurance companies started, So there's so much history that shows that, throughout the entire time, Black people were fighting back and were resisting, and they just weren't, taking it laying down. I mean, that's why we're even free today. And I do wish that side was talked about more. I think he mentioned Nat Turner, and that's pretty much it. But I mean, there were just so much more. And I think if that had also been talked about, then it would have gave it a more accurate picture as to what was happening in history. Because best believe you didn't have these big old strong Black men just laying down there taking it like nothing. People were fighting back brutally. And like I said, that's partially why we're free today. So something I wish that I saw more of. Now, one thing that I flat out disagree with is towards the end of the documentary, he made the comment that essentially African immigrants are coming over to America and they are leading the charge in LGBTQ agenda that is trying to undermine Black progress. That's essentially what he said in so many words. Africa generally is very conservative. So Black people are being born and raised in a conservative nation to come over and push a liberal ideology. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. It just does not. Black people from Africa are coming from conservative nations to push a liberal ideology that's going to undermine Black people. Like, I just tell me and show me where immigrants, Black immigrants in particular, have that much power, that much political power. Please show me. I've yet to see it. I see no evidence to suggest that they're the ones leading the charge, especially as it pertains to trying to undermine Black progress. I just don't see that. If you have examples, let me know, guys. Let me know in the comment section if I'm missing something. But it just doesn't really make sense to me. Also, when you actually look up the Rainbow Coalition, you see that it is not only for Black people. It's not even only for Africans. This is something that is open to people who have issues with gender identity. It reaches across all nations. So it's not just for Black folks. So that's why it just, no matter how you look at it, no matter what angle you look at it, to me, it just doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really stand up under scrutiny. So I understand it's just his opinion, but I don't agree. Overall, I did enjoy the documentary. As I mentioned, I think it pretty much hit on its goal to provide a different perspective on slavery that's not usually talked about. I didn't agree with everything, and there's a couple of things I wish were added, but I think overall it did hit on its objective. Shout out to JoJo, who gave me the idea to review this content, to review this video. Definitely appreciate it. But guys, let me know what you think. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? Did I miss something? Let me know. Leave your comments down in the comment section below. Be sure to hit the like button if you haven't already. Hit the subscribe button. And thank you so much for listening if you've gotten this far. And we'll talk later. Bye.